Hi, class. So today we're going to be talking about Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. So in our previous lesson, we learned about the major events of the war, how the war affected the American home front. We've already learned that we defeated Germany. Now we do need to talk about what the United States' goals were in fighting this war. At least what Woodrow Wilson's goals were, because that's going to have an effect on how the peace treaty negotiations proceed now that Germany's been defeated. And we'll go much more in depth on the Paris Peace Conference and the actual treaty that is written up in an upcoming lesson. But right now, we need to understand what his goals were in fighting this war, ideologically. So as we go into January of 1918, let's remind ourselves of the context, the background that's going on, especially relative to World War One. So first of all, in April of 1917, a lot of the context is what happened in 1917. You have the U.S. declaring war on Germany during that year. The main argument they give is this unrestricted submarine warfare that the Germans are undertaking. You also have the fall of the Russian Empire. You have the revolution that overthrows the Tsar in February, March of 1917. And then in October, you have the Bolsheviks or the communists take over Russia in a coup. This essentially, the Bolsheviks, once they take over, they have no interest in terms of continuing the war with Germany. Remember, Russia was fighting with Britain and France against Germany. So now that the communists have taken over, you have an armistice, a peace, a ceasefire is declared, and the Russians are in the process of negotiating the terms of a treaty with Germany and the other Central Powers. So Russia, they're kind of negotiating the Brest-Litovsk Treaty um, on as this is all going on. On top of that, you have because the Central Powers don't have to focus on Russia on the Eastern Front anymore. The Germans are trying to bring its troops back to the Western Front, and they want to do it before the United States can mobilize its forces in any significant way. So there's a race to the Western Front between essentially, can Germany get its troops and do an offensive that can probably put France out of the war before the United States has a chance to significantly reinforce the Western Front. So this is essentially between Germany redeploying troops from the Eastern Front um, versus now new American troops who are going to be arriving on the Western Front. So this is the backdrop. This is the context. No one really knows what exactly was going to happen on the Western Front. Certain military analysts will say Germany was able to prosecute this two-front war against a major empire and Russia. And now they're going to be able to focus completely, the Germans are going to be able to focus completely on the Western Front. And Germany might be able to deal the decisive blow that they needed to. Others, though, would say that the United States is this emerging power. It's bringing fresh troops in. It has major industrial capacity. The United States could, especially if the war were to last a good long time, the United States might be the decisive element for the Allies and help them to turn the tide. And as we learned in our previous lesson, that's what ends up happening. But that's the background in which President Woodrow Wilson, in January of 1918, he gives this speech on January 8th to the joint session of Congress. And this is part of the text of the speech. I'm just going to read through it. I'm not going to read the entire speech. He talks about many things. Essentially, why are we in World War One? What is the moral causes of World War One? And his speech is most famous for his articulation of the 14 points. So let's just read into it because it really informs a lot of what happened in the Treaty of Versailles, which is essentially, like I said, the peace treaty with Germany, which the United States, ironically, does not end up ratifying. But it also lays out the tension in the Paris peace conferences after World War One between those who were more idealistic, like Woodrow Wilson, and those who might have been a little bit more vengeful, especially against the Central Powers. So here we go. This is part of the speech. We enter this war because violations of right had occurred which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible unless they were corrected and the world secured once for all against their recurrence. right? What we demand in this war, therefore, is nothing peculiar to ourselves. It is that the world be made fit and safe to live in. So this is very idealistic. Remember, all these others, especially these European powers, are all about who gets what land, who gets what empire, who gets to take advantage of whatever colony, right? And particularly that it be made safe for every peace-loving nation, which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealing by the other peoples of the world as against force and selfish aggression. All the peoples of the world are, in effect, partners in this interest, right? And for our own part, we see very clearly that unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. The program of the world's peace, therefore, is our program. And that program, the only possible program, all we see it, is this. So he's basically saying these are his 14 points, right? And I'll try to kind of give some context for each one of them as we go through them. So the first is open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view. The context here is actually after the Bolsheviks took over, the communists in Russia, they started releasing all these secret covenants and agreements and understandings that the Russian Empire had been getting into. We already talked about all the entanglements and the alliances that led to World War I. So this is Wilson's attempt to say, hey, let's just do everything out in the open, transparency. That'll let everyone kind of know, give more transparency what may or may not occur based on their actions, right? So he's calling for more transparency. Number 2, absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas, outside territorial waters, alike in peace and in war, except as the seas may be closed in whole or in part by international action for the enforcement of international covenants. So no more of these, basically what he's saying is no more of these British blockades, no more of this unrestricted submarine warfare. The only time we can dictate what happens in open waters, in the open seas, is if the international community trying to decide what it wants to enforce in terms of international agreements, right? So we all need to agree. It can't just be one country saying you can't come into this region of the ocean or we'll sink you, or you can't go to this port and trade here, right? This is off limits. So no more of that. Number 3, the removal of all economic barriers and the establishment of equality of trade conditions among all the nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance. So essentially it's free trade. Free trade is what he's calling for, right? Number 4, adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. So here he's trying to undo some of this militarism, this buildup of arms that essentially allowed World War I to happen in the first place, with the ferocity that it happened, and with the quickness with which it occurred, right? So remember those causes of World War I. He's trying to eliminate militarism as an issue. Number 5, a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principles that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. So that sounds very confusing, but this is a very big deal. That probably it didn't really make the British or the French or any empire happy. This is essentially saying self-determination. The people who are living in these nations, in those states throughout Europe and the world, their interests matter just as much, right? And I'll talk more about this in a bit here. So a free, open-minded, actually I'm going to go back here, a free, open-minded, absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. So again, this is a pretty big deal. Remember, we're kind of exiting this period of empires, right? Most of the European powers still think that these international empires are essentially part of their prestige, right? And he's calling into question that. He's challenging that. Number 6, the evacuation of all Russian territory in such a settlement of all questions affecting Russia as will secure the best and freest cooperation of the other nations of the world in obtaining for her an unhampered and an unembarrassed opportunity for the independent determination of her political development and national policy, and assure her of a sincere welcome into the society of free nations under institutions of her own choosing. So this is still one sentence, right? And then you put a period there, semicolon, very long first sentence. And I guess he had to, read that himself. I'm surprised. And he goes on, and more than a welcome assistance also of every kind that she may need and may herself desire. The treatment accorded Russia by her sister nations in the months to come. Remember, they're negotiating with the Central Powers on Brest-Litovsk. So remember, the Russians and Central Powers, Germany, are negotiating because Russia's been taken out. To come will be the acid test of their goodwill, of their comprehension of her needs as distinguished from their own interests, and of their intelligent and unselfish sympathy. So basically he's saying, look, Wilson doesn't know whether the Allies or the Central Powers are going to win on the Western Front, right? At this point in the war, it wasn't clear. But the Allies, Wilson, they know that the Central Powers are dictating terms to Russia with Brest-Litovsk. They know Russia's trying to exit the war. They know that they're trying to negotiate a peace treaty between Germany and Russia. And it's like, this is going to be the test of your goodwill, of your comprehension of the need of this newly emerging state now that the Bolsheviks have taken over. Obviously, at this point, you don't have the antagonism between the US and the future Soviet Union that's going to emerge. But they're saying, give Russia a chance to be herself. That's what Wilson's calling for. So, number 7, Belgium, the whole world will agree, must be evacuated and restored without any attempt to limit the sovereignty which she enjoys in common with all other free nations. So this is kind of obvious. When the Germans rolled through Belgium, that's how they got to France, right? And started the war. This was a justification that Great Britain used for entering the war in the first place. So what Wilson is saying here is for Germany to get out of Belgium, right? Belgium needs to be independent again. Number 8, all French territory should be freed and invaded portions restored, and the wrong done to France by Prussia in 1871 in the matter of Alsace-Lorraine, which has unsettled the peace of the world for nearly 50 years, should be righted in order that peace may once more be made secure in the interest of all. So Alsace-Lorraine, which I addressed in a previous video, that's this region right here that you see on this map in orange, right? This region was taken by Germany. Essentially, the unification of Germany during the Franco-Prussian War, which was this was formerly a French region, right? And the Prussians defeat France in the Franco-Prussian War, and they capture this region known as Alsace-Lorraine. So this was why France might have gone into a war with Germany, and what Germany almost wanted to be preemptive against France, because they said France might want to take some of that territory back. So that was the source of tension between the two. So again, Wilson's trying to fix this and to address this cause. Number 9, right? A readjustment of the frontiers of Italy should be effected along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. So, hey, where do people speak Italian, right? That's where the Italian state should be. Next, number 10, the peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity of autonomous development. So this is another big deal. It's another breaking up of an empire. It's another self-determination point of the 14 points. So Austria-Hungary, we've already learned it was an empire. It included many, many, many nationalities. You have the Czechs, you have the Slovaks, you have the Austrians, who are German-speaking peoples, you have the Hungarians, you have the Slovenians, you have the Croatians, You also have Bosnians all living in the same empire. You have many, many other nationalities, especially as you get closer to the border with Romania and the border with Ukraine. And what Wilson's basically saying, it's like, let these people let them determine their own fate to some degree. There are all these nationalities. That was number 10, right? So let these people determine their own fate, to form their own state, to choose their own government, is what he's arguing for. Where you see it says the freest opportunity to autonomous development. He's not saying that they necessarily need their own states, but that they should have the opportunity to self-govern in some way, right? Now, number 11, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro should be evacuated, occupied territories restored, Serbia accorded free and secure access to the sea, and the relations of the several Balkan states to one another determined by friendly counsel along historically established lines of allegiance and nationality, and international guarantees of the political and economic independence and territorial integrity of the several Balkan states should be entered into. So this is kind of laying the groundwork for the future state of Yugoslavia, which is going to be right over here on this map. It's right here in the Balkans, right? And it's kind of the state of this, it's known as the state of the Southern Slavs, which is what the whole motivation for assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which some would argue was kind of the spark that lit World War I, right? Remember that it was the Black Hand, it was these Serbian nationalists who wanted to be independent from Austria-Hungary, that this was their motivation from the beginning, was to break away, and that's why they assassinated the Archduke. Now, the next one. The Turkish portions of the present Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty, but the other nationalities which are now under Turkish rule should be assured an undoubted security of life and an absolutely unmolested opportunity of an autonomous development. Once again, self-determination is what you see here. And the Dardanelles should be permanently opened as a free passage to the ships and commerce of all nations under international guarantees. So the Dardanelles, we haven't really talked about them, but that's this region right here. You can see it on the map, right? And you have access here between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. So clearly it's a trading route. And it was important. They wanted this to be opened up to trade. That's what Wilson is calling for here. So then you have this next one. It says an independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations, which should be assured a free and secure access to the sea, and whose political and economic independence and territorial integrity should be guaranteed by international covenant. So Poland did not exist as its own country, as its own state prior to World War I. Now you have Woodrow Wilson is here. He's advocating it. He wants them to become their own independent nation. And it will be carved out roughly in this area right here. If you look where I'm pointing with the cursor on this map, right? Then finally, for point 14, probably one of the most important of all the points, it says, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small nations alike. So this is essentially, this is the point that leads to the formation of something called the League of Nations. When we talk about big ideas, this is a big idea, especially back then. You had Europe who, they kept getting into wars with each other. And Wilson's like, hey, why don't we all cooperate at this middle level, and we have this club of all the nations to resolve disputes and make sure that we don't have another World War I. So it's a very, very, very big idealistic idea. It gets formed as an outcome of the Treaty of Versailles, which is drafted during the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. And the unfortunate thing of the League of Nations is that even though this was kind of, the idea was coming from Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations was not ratified by the United States. The United States never entered the League of Nations, which kind of made it a bit hollow. It was weak because the United States never joined. And the League of Nations did not have the power to stop World War II from happening only a few decades later. And it would later be replaced by the United Nations, or the UN, which still exists today. So, nevertheless, this is a really, 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 really big idea. Because of these big ideas, Woodrow Wilson, these very idealistic ideas, everyone in Europe is talking about territory and imperialism and how do they take control of other people, take control of their resources. And now you have the American president saying it's all about self-determination. It's about making the world safe for democracy, safe for business, for commerce, for trade, about open agreements. It's a very powerful idea. This kind of would form the basis, the more idealistic side of American foreign policy over the 20th century. And some would say that there's another very cynical side that takes into account self-interest. But this is the idealistic side of American foreign policy, especially through the 20th century. And for his work in this area, Woodrow Wilson wins the Nobel Prize for Peace a few years later. And this right here is a picture of the Nobel Prize, what it looks like from one side. So let's look at the five principles that you should remember from Wilson's 14 points. So first of all, freedom of the seas. All right, what we're trying to do here is keep a war from happening again. So each of these is looking at one of the causes of World War I. So if you look at the arms race before World War I, and also that neutral nations such as the United States should be able to use the seas without interference. That's what that goal was, freedom of the seas. Then reduction of arms, the arms race. Once again, that people were building up before the war, and after the war is over, we need to reduce arms. We need to stop militarism, the buildup of arms. Open treaty negotiations. A lot of secret agreements were made before and during World War I. So Wilson says we don't need these secret agreements anymore. Self-determination of peoples. Nationalism and the Austrian Empire was one of the causes of World War I. So what we need to do is we need to break up the Austrian Empire. We need to take some land away from Germany and break up the Ottoman Empire and these other empires. And we need to create states that are based on nationality. And then 5, we need to create a League of Nations, right? Now, just to kind of foreshadow some of the tension as we get into the Paris Peace Conference, which we will talk about in a future lesson, not everyone was as idealistic as Woodrow Wilson. You obviously, these European powers who bled much harder than the Americans did. Remember how many Europeans died in this war compared to American soldiers? Remember Russia and Germany? So although the Americans did contribute significant cost or troops to the effort, and they lost many people, obviously, if you're French, if you're Russian, if you're German, if you're French and you had these Germans on your territory, you lost a significant fraction of your population. A huge fraction of your male population was killed. And because of that, you might be a little bit angrier than the United States. So, of course, you have people like Georges Clemenceau, who was the prime minister of France, and he was a little bit more skeptical of Wilson's 14 points. So this is a quote from him. He actually has many slightly entertaining quotes, but this is just one of them. He says, "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points, while God Almighty has only 10. Right? So he's saying like there's too many of his points. Even God himself only had 10. So he's kind of mocking Mr. Woodrow Wilson. So this will kind of foreshadow some of the tension between Clemenceau and the British and European allies on one side, and the Americans on the other side as we go into the Paris Peace Conference. The Europeans were looking out for revenge, especially against the Germans, while the Americans, especially Woodrow Wilson, were a lot more idealistic. And we'll talk about that in our future lesson. So let me know if you have any questions.